Good evening. Sudan is at breaking point, caught between a war that shows no sign of slowing and a humanitarian crisis that worsens by the day. Since fighting erupted in April 2023 between the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support Forces, tens of thousands have been killed and nearly 12 million people forced from their homes. A crisis UN officials now call the world's worst humanitarian disaster. In recent weeks, dramatic developments on the ground have reshaped how the world views this conflict and raised urgent questions about the path forward, from the scale of civilian suffering to the growing calls for peace. Tonight we take a closer look at Sudan's crisis, the human toll, the shifting international response, and whether the world can still help pull the country back from the edge. Welcome to Think Tank.
Our world is becoming unhinged.
Welcome to the program. The United Nations top human rights body has launched an urgent investigation into mass killings in Sudan, warning that the world is doing too little to stop the country's worsening humanitarian crisis. According to the New York Times, officials used a special session in Geneva to sound the alarm over atrocities in El Fasher, a Darfur city seized last month by the Rapid Support Forces after an 18-month siege that left civilians starving and neighborhoods in ruins. The new resolution calls for an immediate ceasefire and full humanitarian access. After more than 2 years of civil war, 14 million people have been displaced and almost 400,000 are on the brink of famine, making Sudan the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And as Sudan's humanitarian crisis deepens, Egypt is urging an immediate ceasefire and a full humanitarian truce to stop the bloodshed and pave the way for a political process that keeps the country united. According to Egypt Independent, Egypt's foreign minister spoke with a senior White House advisor on Saturday, stressing the need to halt the fighting, protect civilians, and open the door for aid. The foreign minister also condemned the horrific atrocities and violations in El Fasher, calling for intensified regional and international efforts to support the Sudanese people and their national institutions.
Sudan is facing one of the worst crises in the world today. The country is trapped between a brutal war and a fast-moving humanitarian disaster. And many are asking whether international action can still make a difference. The conflict began in April 2023 when fighting broke out between the Sudanese army led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the Rapid Support Forces commanded by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. What started as a powerful struggle has turned into a nationwide catastrophe. More than 150,000 people have been killed, and about 12 million have been forced from their homes. The UN says Sudan is now the world's largest humanitarian crisis. The capture of El Fasher by the RSF marked a devastating turning point. Reports of mass killings and systematic attacks against civilians have intensified global alarm. In response, the UN Human Rights Council has unanimously agreed to launch a new independent investigation into the atrocities reported in El Fasher. It's a rare moment of global unity and a sign that the world is finally recognizing the scale of the crisis. But the big question remains, will these efforts be enough to stop the war? Peace still seems far away, and millions in Sudan cannot afford to wait much longer. Sudan now stands at a critical crossroads between deeper conflict and a chance for peace. The world's next steps may decide which path it takes.
Joining us tonight to shine a light on Sudan is Khaled Dawood, managing editor of Al Ahram weekly newspaper in Cairo, and Dr. Mohammed Osman as well, international relations specialist. Welcome to you both. I'll start with you, Khaled Dawood. Sudan, how close is the country to a full-scale collapse?
Well, thanks, Mark, for having me. Hopefully it's not close to that kind of collapse. But the closer scenario, which many people fear, is the division, or the further division, actually, of Sudan, as we have known it historically. As you have mentioned, right now, the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, they control almost all of Western Sudan, while the official Sudanese army, the Sudanese Armed Forces, they control the eastern parts. And already the RSF is escalating its attacks on other territories controlled by the Sudanese Armed Forces. So if, international efforts did not speed up and press hard on all the concerned parties to end that war, it's very possible to see a second division of Sudan after already the southern Sudan has seceded back in 2011. We can see a state in Darfur and a state in eastern Sudan and a further conflict among the different factions and parties that make up the very complicated Sudanese political scene.
And Dr. Osman, one of the things that I get asked most is, what is this all about? We know there's a long history, but what is it in this particular conflict that the different factions want?
Thank you for having me, Mark. Greetings to you and to Mr. Dawood and to the honorable audience. Of course, what we are witnessing in Sudan is the accumulation of decades of animosity and grievances between the different components of Sudanese society. Even though the conflict has metastasized into this war between the regular armed forces, the legitimate military force of Sudan, and the rogue rapid support forces, which is basically a collection of ethnic militias from Western Sudan that were given a legitimate framework when they were turned into the rapid support forces by the Omar al-Bashir regime as a parallel military force. However, this is not only a conflict between those two military components, it's also a conflict between the inhabitants, tribes inhabiting the Nile Valley, the fertile, rich Nile Valley of Sudan, and also the semi-nomadic Arab tribes of Western Sudan, which the Rapid Support Forces and their leadership, including General Hemeti or Hamdan Dagalo, hail from, basically. So this is a historical conflict between these components of modern-day Sudan. And there is also another dimension in a conflict within Western Sudan itself between those indigenous semi-nomadic Arab tribes that are the main rank and file of the Rapid Support Forces, and the the tribes that hail from African descent, non-Arab African descent, like the Fur, the Masalit, and the Zaghawa. And those are the civilian inhabitants who were subjected to these horrendous acts. In Al-Fashir, for example, they constitute the majority of the inhabitants of a city like Al-Fashir, and 2,000 of them at least were exterminated within the space of a couple of days, if not a few hours. We've seen that, and of course, Al-Fashir is not the first massacre. We have seen an even more horrendous massacre in the initial phase of this war in the summer of 2023, when the town of Al-Junaina in Darfur, also on the border between Sudan and Chad, was captured by the RSF and was subjected to 10 days of ransacking and mass killings that, according to the UN Office of the Human Rights, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, resulted in the death of 15,000 civilians within less than 10 days. So you can imagine how dire the humanitarian situation is, Mark, at this point. Yeah. The army seeks to maintain itself as the legitimate government, internationally recognized government of Sudan, and to stop this armed rebellion by the RSF, while the RSF at first seek to capture the entirety of Sudan and basically take over power. Now, after the defeat in Khartoum, they have been unable to achieve that. So it seems now, as Mr. Dawood said, they are seeking to create a reality where of the partition of the partition, basically.
Okay.
Sudan was partitioned back in 2011. Now it might be partitioned once again to East and West Sudan due to the situation on the ground.
And Mr. Dawood, coming to you now, Dr. Osman giving us a few examples, but how would you say this conflict has escalated over the past 2 years?
Well, I mean, besides all the important factors that Dr. Othman explained in terms of the composition of the Sudanese society and its different ethnicities and tribes, I think a very important factor in this conflict is the role of outside parties who are intervening within Sudan to serve their own regional interests. Unfortunately, there are some African countries that support the RSF and not the official Sudanese army institution. There are some Arab countries as well that seem divided on this issue. I mean, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, I mean, they recognize, of course, the divisions that Dr. Osman referred to, but at the same time, they want to stress the importance of the continuation of the existence of a national institution such as the army, while other Arab countries are not on the same side, and they provide important support to the RSF. And I think you've already seen the display of this kind of dismay over the interference of outside forces, whether in the UN resolution that was issued condemning the RSF attacks and also the statements that are being made by the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco. They were pretty significant because for the first time they named the RSF as being a key violator and the reason behind the current humanitarian disaster in Sudan, but he preferred not to name the Arab countries that support the RSF, although he said that one of those Arab countries, they are a member of the quartet, or as known as the Quad, which includes Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates, and that they are putting pressure on all the parties involved in the Sudanese conflict to convince their own contacts within Sudan to accept this September 12 statement that called for a humanitarian truce for 3 months to be followed by negotiations over a permanent ceasefire. But as long as outside support continues for the different warring parties, I think it's going to be difficult to see a settlement for this ongoing conflict, considering that even though the Sudanese army institution is a very important one, but it also has its own divisions, and some countries are not so sure that the current army in Sudan is capable of maintaining overall control. But what I want to stress is that the United States, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, together with Turkey and Qatar, they should definitely exert the same effort we've seen in Gaza, for example, in order to bring the parties at least to accept a humanitarian truce and to deal with this extremely disastrous humanitarian situation in Al-Fashir and the flow of displaced people and the people who were killed. That should be a priority more than anything else at this point.
Yes, indeed. I mean, Al-Fashir has seemed to have become the inflection point. Mohammed Osman, coming to you, why is Al-Fashir strategically so critical, and what do these atrocities that have been committed? We've seen the videos. It's terrifying, horrifying, and very upsetting to see these videos. What does that signal about the nature of the war going forward?
Unfortunately, in this war, most factions, especially the RSF, has resorted to the most vile means in achieving their aims. And of course, to understand what's going on in Al-Fashir, we have to understand two things. First of all, the significance of the fall of Al-Fashir at this point and how catastrophic it is for the Sudanese army. It is because Al-Fashir was the last stronghold. It is one of the fourth or fifth largest city in Sudan, by the way, and it is the largest city in the Darfur province. And the Darfur province is so big that it is divided into 4 administrative provinces. as well. So Al-Fashir was the largest urban center over there, and it did have great symbolic value in terms of the legitimate government of Sudan, the internationally recognized government of Sudan, which is led by the military, that it maintains a presence in this very strategic region, which has been mostly fallen under the control of the rapid support forces. However, with the fall of Al-Fashir, of course, this created a catastrophe because now basically most of West Sudan, most of the Darfur province, and very significant parts as well of Kordofan do fall under the control of the RSF. RSF now controls over 1/3 of Sudan, and Sudan is a huge country, as you might very well know, Mark. So this is the significance of the fall of Al-Fashir politically and strategically and militarily even. On the other hand, as well, there is a problem that in order to understand the atrocities that transpired in Sudan, we have to understand that the Sudanese army, the Rapid Support Forces, has been they were before that they were composed of the Janjaweed militias. The Janjaweed militias were used by Omar al-Bashir, the regime of former President Omar al-Bashir, to execute the notorious Darfur genocide between 2003 and 2008 against the same African groups that I mentioned earlier, which are the indigenous inhabitants of Darfur. So now they are recreating the same tactics, but now instead of being these irregular militias, they have become an organized military force with much more firepower, and as Mr. Dawood pointed out, with substantial external support from certain regional powers. So, of course, this gives them quite the capabilities to undertake atrocities that are unprecedented in the conflicts of Sudan as we have known them. Unfortunately, what's going on in Al-Fashir and before that in Al-Junaynah and other towns and villages over the past 2 years and a half is tantamount to acts of genocide. As far as we know, about 150,000 people have died so far due to violent causes, and also about 500,000 people died due to, mostly children, due to malnutrition and famine in some parts of Sudan. And most of these atrocities, of course, are occurring in West Sudan, but not exclusively there. Other parts of Sudan are witnessing very horrendous events as well. So as you can see, Mark, this humanitarian catastrophe is going completely unnoticed. Maybe Al-Fashir, because there was so much media attention on it, it revealed the true scale of the disaster in Sudan. However, that this disaster is not something new, and it is something that has caused great suffering to the people of Sudan over the past couple of years, and everyone pretty much ignored it, unfortunately.
Of course, those are amazingly enormous numbers of people who have died either through violence or through famine. Coming to you, Khalid Dawood, you mentioned there about countries outside, regional players, international players coming together to try and sort the situation out, United States, Egypt, and others. What is the critical factor, would you say, that is currently the biggest impediment to a successful peace agreement in Sudan?
Well, I mean, one of the key factors, Mark, is the complicated Sudanese political scene. As you know, I mean, the Sudan has witnessed a great popular revolution against former President al-Bashir in 2019. And Sudan, despite all its divisions, it has a political tradition, and it has some important political parties that they were hopefully going to form their own civilian government and democratic elections. But unfortunately, the process didn't go as it was hoped to do, and the interference of the military. And it's pretty ironic, to be honest, that at one point, Mr. Burhan, the leader of the army, and the leader of RSF, Mr. Hmedati, they were both allies in toppling the democratically elected government that was in office in 2019. And they actually stayed together for maybe like close to 3 years before there were these kinds of worries and fears about the RSF as a militia, whether it should be integrated in the army. Hmedati refused. Hmedati has his own international connections, And despite the fact that the majority of the Sudanese people live a miserable life, one has to admit, of course, at the same time, Sudan is a country full of capabilities. I mean, one of the key regional countries that is supporting the RSF, they have a lot of investments in Sudan's gold mines. They have massive agricultural projects that they want to start working on. And of course, we cannot forget the strategic shores that Sudan maintains overlooking the Red Sea. So, I mean, and the River Nile water. I mean, these are all issues that make Sudan a very much important target for many players to have a strong influence on. But for us, Egypt here, it's a different story because we are neighbors. We've had historic relations for so many centuries, actually. And whenever there were any political trouble happening in Sudan, Egypt was the country that hosts millions of the Sudanese people. So for us, Sudan is not a matter of investment or looking for opportunities. It's a matter of national security. And that's why you will see Egypt among the countries mostly involved in seeking restoration of stability in Sudan, working along with the United States. Because, again, it's an important factor, Mark, at least at this stage, that the Trump administration is considering Sudan to be an important issue to work on after long ignoring that file after Trump came into office almost a year ago. So now we have the U.S. envoy to Sudan and Africa, Mr. Mus'ad Bolas. He's been in touch and in contact since the fall of al-Fashir with all the concerned parties, not just the quartet, the four countries that are working on the Sudanese issue for the past 3 years, but also other countries that might have an influence on the Sudanese army, namely Qatar and Turkey, working with Mr. Burhan of Sudan, while at the same time the United Arab Emirates should also consider or reconsider its policies in support of the RSF, because that's causing it a lot of criticism all over the world, including from the United States.
And Mohammed Osman, coming to you, do you think there is a realistic pathway back to a unified civilian-led government?
Well, the thing is, Mark, this war has to end first, or at least it has to be paused before any political solution can be pursued, let alone the return of the civilian rule in Sudan. As Mr. Dawood pointed out, there was a civilian government. It wasn't elected, but it was chosen by through Sudanese political consensus between the different political actors and also the military components, whether the army or the rapid support forces. However, the two military components decided to get rid of the civilian government, and later on they turned on one another when Hemeti or the RSF attempted to carry out a violent coup or a violent takeover of Sudan, basically, which plunged the country into a vicious civil war. However, the idea that civilian actors or political actors have to be included in the conversation is essential, and that is why Egypt has hosted several high-scale meetings and even hosted and organized conferences for the civilian political actors of Sudan, the political forces and the political parties of Sudan, so that they can put forward some sort of vision. But the problem is, Mark, that some components of the civilian forces are polarized, and some of them are even now gravitated towards the RSF. There is even talk that Mr. Hamdouk, the former prime minister, who was stoppered in the takeover that the RSF and the army undertook in 2021, actually now is more sympathetic or has several understandings with the RSF and General Hemeti, the leader of the RSF militia. So it's very complicated at this point. So it seems that there has to be a comprehensive solution. Of course, that the political actors, especially the civilian political actors, have to be a part of. However, this can never be achieved while the war is still going on, because those civilians do not command troops on the ground. They have no influence on how things go on the ground. The country is in a state of civil war right now. So now it is a question of whether there can be a roadmap for a national reconciliation and some sort of transitional justice and a plan to turn over power to a neutral actor maybe, or will we see a scenario where the war is paused and the country is basically partitioned? Because we have seen several similar trends in the region. We have in Libya, and in Yemen, two countries that are now that have witnessed uprisings and civil wars and are now de facto partitioned between two governments, one recognized by most of the world and the other recognized by none or by a few. We are seeing this trend in Libya. We are seeing this trend in Yemen. We are seeing it to a lesser extent in Syria with de facto autonomous regions in the Eastern Euphrates or in al-Suwaidah. I'm afraid that we might see a very similar scenario in Sudan if the war or the conflict is frozen. So I think that now it falls upon the Quartet and the United Nations, of course, to push forward for a comprehensive solution that maintains the stability and the unity of governance of Sudan.
Khaled Dawood, coming to you. Dr. Osman mentioned a little while ago that until the al-Fasher situation, many countries around the world had ignored this particular conflict. We have millions displaced. We have famine. What must the international community do that it isn't doing yet?
Well, the question is for me, Mark.
Yes, it's for you, Khaled.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, again, the key effort that's much needed from the international community right now is to bring the parties together and to agree on a humanitarian truce, on an immediate truce. That would allow room for negotiations with pressure on all the Sudanese parties involved, and it's a very complicated political map. As Mr. Osman mentioned, even within Darfur, the fall of al-Fasher is not just a symbolic defeat, but it's also a defeat for some of the key allies for Mr. Burhan within Sudan itself. They felt they were betrayed and left alone by the Sudanese army, so this is going to make any compromises more difficult. There are certain parties that support Mr. Burhan within Sudan that are not going to accept any compromise with the RSF after a long bloodshed and infighting amongst themselves. So that's why, I mean, they need to put pressure on those parties, at least to allow the free flow of humanitarian aid, very much needed humanitarian aid into the different Sudanese cities, particularly Darfur at this point, if it's difficult to agree on all the conditions necessary to bring an end to the war. So perhaps we can see some important meetings in the coming few days. Already there is the Saudi Crown Prince, Mr. Mohammed bin Salman. He's meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump on Tuesday at the White House. Definitely, Sudan is going to be one of the issues to be discussed. Already, the Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdel Ati has been in touch with the U.S. envoy to the Africa, Mr. Mesad Boulos, and they are working together on perhaps some resolution at the United Nations Security Council to bring the parties to end the ongoing military conflict. So again, the priority is right now bringing even a temporary truce to this war so that people can start working on the hard to the suffering Sudanese people.
Okay, and Mohammed Osman, coming to you, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but are there immediate steps that could be taken to save lives in the next few weeks?
I think that it is instrumental, just as Mr. Dawood said. We cannot speak about any actual steps that would alleviate or actually alleviate the suffering of the Sudanese people on the ground, especially in the conflict-torn areas, but a humanitarian truce. The Quartet, or the Quad as they call it, is pushing for a humanitarian truce that would last for about 3 months. The belligerents, unfortunately, so far have demonstrated that they are not really willing to commit on the ground, even though the RSF accepted it in principle. However, on the ground, as Marco Rubio said, they were not demonstrating that they are willing to do that at all. And the army basically flatly rejected it later afterwards. So as long as we do not have a humanitarian truce, there are very little chances that the humanitarian situation can be alleviated, let alone improved. Because in al-Fasher, we have 100,000 people trapped inside the city of al-Fasher right now. They are being prevented from leaving, and now a media blackout has been imposed on al-Fasher. For all we know, more and more massacres might be taking place as we speak, Mark, and we will never get to know anything about them for months or even years on at least.
Well, thank you very much indeed to both of you. We'll continue to watch this situation closely. Dr. Mohammed Osman, International Relations Specialist, and Khaled Dawood, Managing Editor at Al Ahram Weekly. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Think Tank, where we always try to unveil the complexities of our changing world. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.